Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Caitlin Salins, Executive Project Manager of Bringing Theory to Practice. Welcome to AAC&U's webinar, Wellbeing and Equity. This webinar is a collaboration between the Association of American Colleges and Universities and Bringing Theory to Practice. You should see on your webinar screen two buttons that you may use during the webinar. The first is the Q&A button, which can be used to submit questions to our webinar panel. We'll try to answer some of those as we go, and we'll save others for our Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. The second button is the chat button. Please enter questions in the chat button for our IT staff who are with us for today's webinar. They will be happy to assist you with any technology questions that you might have. I am so pleased to introduce today's webinar presenters, Dr. Nicole Brocato, Director of the Wellbeing Assessment at Wake Forest University, and Dr. Jo Ellen Walker, Wellness Director of the Georgetown Scholars Program at Georgetown University. All right, jumping into a quick overview of our session. In the spirit of Bringing Theory to Practice's name, we wanted our presentation today to share practical takeaways grounded in theory and research. So with that in mind, we'll start with Nicole discussing how we define both well-being and equity and why exploring the connection is important for today's students. We'll be diving into some data to see what the research tells us about this theoretical framing, and we'll talk through models for understanding what we can do with this information. From there, Jo Ellen will give us an on-the-ground look at Georgetown Scholars Program, which is an exemplar of how a campus can practically attend to the connection between equity and well-being. She'll also talk us through some takeaways that might apply to different levels of organizational change so that we can hopefully leave you with some tools to make use of in your own context. With that, I am pleased to turn the webinar over to Nicole Brocato. Nicole?
Thank you, Caitlin, for that lovely introduction. I am going to get us started here with an examination of why equity and well-being is important by looking at some descriptive statistics about our current undergraduate students. The statistics in this first slide come from the National Center for Education Statistics and also from a large consortium of survey research led by the Tyler Clementi Center at Rutgers. And what these statistics are telling us is that in 2017, we had approximately twice as many students participating in higher education who identified with historically underrepresented racial ethnic groups relative to the year 2000. The rates of women participating in higher education has remained approximately stable, as has the overall number of students participating in education who are 25 years or older. But what we see is that more of those students are participating in education on a full-time basis. The rates of first-generation students, again, appear to be about stable, perhaps even declining a little bit, and a significant portion of our students identify as LGBTQ. So all taken together, these statistics show us that our students are increasingly diverse and increasingly diverse in a number of ways. To look at our students' longitudinal well-being trends, I clipped this wonderful infographic here from ACE's Higher Education Today blog. This graphic from Ellen Barr-Stolzenberg depicts the rates at which incoming students reported that their mental health was as good or better than the top 10% of their peers. This black line represents men, the bottom green line represents women, and the blue line is an average between the two. And what we're seeing here is that in 1985, more than half of students reported that their mental health was as good or better than the top 10% of their peers. And that average number today has dropped to less than half. And furthermore, we see that the rates for women are declining faster than the rates for men. So when we consider this slide in the context of the previous slide, what we have is a diverse student body in need of well-being supports, which means that equity has to be baked into the foundations of our well-being theory and our well-being programming. So how do we do this? We can get started here by looking at some well-being theory. We have been arguing since the dawn of time as a human race about what optimal functioning and experience are, and I'm not going to be able to resolve that argument today, but I can summarize it for us here. The arguments tend to sort of fall into two camps. One is theories of subjective well-being. And according to these theories, the best indicators of well-being are whether people feel good and whether they think that their lives are good. And the nice thing about these theories is that they place a lot of agency and autonomy within the individual. A challenge with these theories is that people in very affluent and safe circumstances can report levels of well-being that are similar to people in impoverished and challenging circumstances. And in a lot of ways, right, this doesn't make sense. We don't want to say to people in challenging circumstances, well, you clearly have some very good secondary coping skills, and you say you're feeling okay with the fact that you don't have enough money or you don't have enough safety, so good luck to you, right? That doesn't seem right at all. So objective well-being theories are supposed to be an answer to this problem. And according to these theories, what we really need are objective criteria and checklists about what well-being looks like that are developed by experts or somebody external to the individual and which apply to everyone. And these theories solve our problem of different people having different conceptualizations of well-being. But what we're going to see here is that a strict interpretation of objective well-being theory can be at odds with equity. Just as in well-being, there are arguments about what the right conceptualization of equity is. Today, I'm going to argue that equity is about more than providing people with the same resources and hoping that they achieve similar outcomes, because we know that the same resources can actually lead to differential and prejudicial outcomes. That instead, what we should be thinking about when we think about equity is providing people with individually tailored resources for their needs, interests, strengths, and values, and so that they have equal opportunities to achieve equally good outcomes. And a couple of boxes in the slide here make an even stronger claim that sometimes what we need in equity is actually to step back and take a more participatory and critical approach to what good outcomes look like, and just not to assume that we always know what those are. So we can see here, as we're thinking about individually tailored resources and supports, that could be at odds with this objective account that says we need this universal checklist that applies to everybody. So what do we do about that? I'm going to propose a pair of models today to help resolve this tension. One is a process model, which tells us how the components of well-being should be related to each other. And one is a content model. And we're going to spend the next few slides here talking about what I mean by that. So our first model is a process model. Here at the Wellbeing Assessment, we use an adapted version of the engine model of well-being, which was authored by Aranda Jaya-Wickrama, a faculty member here in our psychology department, along with Marie Forgiard and Martin Seligman. And according to this model, there's an important distinction between things that are indicators of well-being, we call these outcomes, and what we call pathways, which are internal to the person and external to the person, skills, resources, and conditions that are necessary for well-being. So let's take a look at an example to see why this is important. In this top purple box here, I have a collection of factors that can be considered defining of or contributing to well-being, or belonging rather, depending on your conceptualization. Some of these are obviously important to everyone, like safety. Others are particularly important to people with marginalized identities, like campus climate, because they can be particularly threatening. Others are differentially important to people just based on preferences and interests, like how many and what kinds of extracurriculars and campus traditions people choose to participate in. Now, if we were to try and make the claim that everything in this purple box is belonging and therefore is equally important to everyone, that would be tantamount to saying that there's only one way to develop and experience belonging, which we know from our equity slide doesn't work. So, oops. So instead, if we pull out feeling belonging as our outcome, as the thing that really is the indicator of belonging, and put the rest of it in this pathways box, now we have a flexible toolkit that can be individually tailored to individual student needs, interests, values, and strengths. Next is our content model. Our content model, remember, is our second in our pair of models. Content models help us to identify where we are looking for outcomes. In other words, what are the well-being dimensions to which we are applying the engine model. This is where we apply our objective accounts of well-being, and we can do it in a way that's equitable and inclusive by using our campus culture, our student needs, interests, and values, and our institutional missions and priorities to decide what content we need in our well-being model. So just creating individualized content models across settings already introduces a level of equity and inclusion. We can also do that over time. So as an example, at Wake, right now, meaning and belonging are really important dimensions to us. But maybe in 10 years from now, civic orientation will be more important to us. So when we put that flexible content model together with the engine model, we end up with something that looks like this. The important contribution here of this model is that it accounts for subjective well-being, objective well-being, and equity all in one place. Over on the left-hand side, we have foundational needs that are important to everyone, things like financial stability, access to care, and basic safety. Over here in our blue column, these are those flexible pathway toolkits that are specific to each of our well-being dimensions. And again, which dimensions we put in this model are a function of those flexible content models that we can adapt to our settings and to our student needs. And what this model says over here on the right-hand side is that if you have your basic needs met and you have access to the pathways that you need in order to be doing well across a variety of well-being dimensions, then your subjective well-being is also probably going to be pretty good. You're probably going to report that you're happy and that you think your life is good. So now let's take a look at all this theory and model in action through some well-being assessment results. We administer the well-being assessment nationally every spring. We've done so for the last several years. We just finished administering this spring to 28 schools across all 4 regions of the country, and that resulted in a sample of about 12,000 students. And all this last bullet point here says is that we weighted our data to make it more representative of national demographics. In this plot, we are looking at the association between students' subjective well-being and their number of self-reported marginalized identities. Because we are just starting this work, this plot only accounts for 4 identities: gender nonconforming, transsexual, non-heterosexual, and historically underrepresented racial ethnic groups. And what we're seeing in this plot is that students who report 4 of these marginalized identities have subjective well-being levels that are about 12% lower than students who report no marginalized identity. And maybe, right, our first impression is 12%, that doesn't seem like a whole bunch. If I got 100 on a test, I'd be pretty happy. If I got an 88% on a test, I'd be pretty happy. But really, when we think again about our equity slide, we don't want any groups to be displaying consistently poor outcomes relative to other folks. So this led my team to ask the question of the data, is there something else in here that might explain what's happening and why we're seeing these results? So we did some additional statistical modeling, and what we're looking at here is structural equation modeling of subjective well-being. It's regressed on a number of other dimensions in the well-being assessment, and every time we entered a well-being dimension, we also included students' numbers of marginalized identities as a covariate. And the exact order and nature of these gray boxes of these well-being dimensions isn't all that important. What is important here is that every single place where we entered this covariate of number of marginalized identities, we saw a negative structural coefficient. And for those of you familiar with structural equation modeling, these aren't huge numbers. The issue more is that there's this very consistent pattern of negative associations. And we did a few iterations of this model, and we saw the same thing over and over again. What my team thinks this means is that there are multi-level, multi-systemic barriers to well-being for people with marginalized identities. And in other words, there isn't one specific or particular problem. Rather, there are lots of problems in lots of places. Now, it's important to remember as we're looking through analyses like those we see on this slide and those we saw on the previous slide, that these analyses provide information about groups of people. They're averages, and averages are rarely exactly true for specific individuals. So while I'm referring here to students with marginalized identities as a general group and saying that in general we need multi-level programming, we also need to remember that our equity theory tells us that we need that programming to be individually tailored. And Dr. Walker is going to talk with us in just a minute about how we do that. And to help frame up that conversation, I'm going to present one last slide here, which is a socio-ecological model. These models are great because they help us think about the complex interactions between individuals and the world around them. There are lots of versions of these models. ACHA has one I've linked here at the bottom of this slide that is tailored to higher education settings, and I happen to really like that version of this model. The version we're looking at today just has 3 levels, and they include factors internal to the individual, like people's personal histories and attitudes and beliefs, people's relationships with families, friends, peers, and importantly for our conversation today, the relationships, students' relationships with faculty and staff. And our 3rd level here are environmental factors that the community brings to bear, such as campus climate and policies and the resources that we make available to our students. And of course, in real life, all these levels interact with each other continually. So this model reminds us that there are many levels at which we can program to support students, which is, again, the need that we saw in our previous slide. I think sometimes in student affairs, we feel a lot of pressure to develop programs that target student skills and things internal to the individual student. But again, what the last slide showed us is that we need that pervasive multi-level response. And of course, consistent with equity theory, we need that to somehow be individually tailorable. And so that's what Dr. Walker is going to talk with us about now, is how we can put all of that into action. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to her.
Thank you, Dr. Bricado. I will say that I am not as tech savvy as Dr. Bricado, so if you hear me saying next, it's because our wonderful partners at AAC&U are going to be advancing my slides for me. Next slide, please. So Dr. Bricado's last points really form a great segue. Currently, we're having conversations in higher education about how to make campuses change for students rather than reverse, having students change to fit the institution. In reality, there is a mutually influential relationship between students and institutions. And I want to start by highlighting and reiterating some of the key points that Dr. Bricado raised. In keeping with the ecological model and shaping the environment to fit student needs, I want to start by defining and discussing the impact of context more broadly on well-being. When an individual has a sense of belonging, being a welcome part of a community, and self-efficacy, the belief that they can successfully meet the demands of their environment, they tend to have higher levels of well-being. Belonging is influenced by at least 3 components that map onto the socio-ecological model that Dr. Bricado shared. People, which corresponds to the relationship level of the model. Campus climate, which corresponds to the community level of the model, and includes aspects such as one's sense of physical and psychological safety, as well as just the sheer numbers of folks around them with similar backgrounds. And finally, cultural background, which corresponds to the individual level of the model. In particular, we want to focus on the match or mismatch between an individual's cultural norms that they're coming in with and that of their current environment. And a mismatch there would result in distress. Next slide, please. So that distress of mismatch between person and environment can look a number of different ways, and this slide just details a few of the concrete examples of what happens or what students may experience when they do not feel a part of campus, connected to others, or that they have fair and equal access to campus resources. There is a good deal of research that supports belonging as a key factor that contributes to students' subjective well-being, retention, and campus engagement. Sometimes there might also be predispositions or pre-existing conditions. The diathesis stress model within health suggests that an environment can be a trigger for something that would otherwise remain latent or manageable. So with more students coming to campus with pre-existing diagnoses, whether they are mental health diagnoses or otherwise, this is something that we seriously want to consider and address proactively. Next slide, please. Before I go into this slide, I do want to offer a disclaimer that while we loved this graphic and felt like it was very helpful in describing the concept, we, the collaborators and presenters, are not aligned with the views of those from the website from which we cited and got this graphic. So now, another big picture factor that affects belonging and the individual level of the model that Dr. Bricado shared with us earlier is intersectionality. And intersectionality was coined in 1989 by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a civil rights activist and legal scholar. And it refers to, as you can see in the graphic, the interconnected nature of our social categorizations. They can also be called social locations, identities, demographic variables, and they will include these things you see in color, sexual orientation, gender, race, etc. But it's really this concept that those things are inextricably linked, they're interconnected, and they create these interdependent systems of disadvantage, discrimination, so that an individual is experiencing the sum of all of those different factors as opposed to siloed or single issue types of difficulties or challenges. As Dr. Bricado mentioned, there is an exponential decrease in one's subjective well-being as their number of historically marginalized or excluded identities increases. This adds to a person's cognitive load, which can be thought of as like a background music or background noise that is constantly with them and uses up some of their cognitive resources that could be used for other tasks, such as paying attention in class for students. At GSP, intersectionality is something that we are constantly reflecting on as we grow and develop our program. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to shift gears and focus on the real world application of all that Dr. Bricado and I have already shared. GSP, or the Georgetown Scholars Program, is not one that students apply to. Instead, they are selected during the admission process. Our program is comprised of high-achieving students with first-generation and/or low-income backgrounds. Next slide, please. The Georgetown Scholars Program was established in 2004 based on student feedback that more than monetary assistance was needed for them to thrive while at Georgetown University, and it has grown from 50 students and 1 full-time employee to more than 600 current students, more than 1,000 alumni, and a staff of 8. Next slide, please. So here, I just want to highlight that our graduation rate is 96.4%, which is slightly higher than Georgetown's general student body graduation rate and significantly higher than the US national average for first-generation students, which is around 30%. Next slide, please. So we serve students in 4 key ways, and I will share about some of our signature programs that fall into each pillar. First, community building. When you talk to current GSPers and alums, they often remark on how GSP was their second family during their time at Georgetown. We start off building this idea of family during our annual induction ceremony, which is a time when we celebrate and welcome all incoming GSPers so that they can meet us as well as one another. We also have GSP family dinners approximately once per month, where dinner is served, so a meal is provided, and it's an informal time for students to mingle with one another, as well as staff, and sometimes we invite faculty or campus partners so they can interact with them in a more informal environment and outside of the classroom. Our second pillar, mentorship and advocacy, includes our peer and alumni mentor programs, as well as my role as a wellness advisor, providing walk-in appointments, short-term individual therapy, health education, in addition to my colleagues who provide one-on-one and group advising on all things Georgetown. So that's anything from course selection, how to use your meal plan, good study spots, things of that nature. Our next pillar is advocacy and empowerment. This includes our annual GS Proud Week, which is a time when we stand with students to proudly name and claim their first generation and low income backgrounds, reclaim their narratives about these identities, and engage the campus in a dialogue about equity, as well as increase the visibility of students, faculty, and staff who did or do currently identify as first generation and low income. This pillar also includes our student board, who are typically upper class students, and they are constantly developing programming, partnerships, and sharing input with us to enhance the program. The last pillar, financial support, I will discuss in greater detail shortly, but I do want to say that we orient our students to all four of these pillars and all of the benefits and resources that GSP entails at GSP 101, which is an orientation that our first year incoming students attend during their first year, preferably the first term, but that's not always possible. Next slide, please. So to go into our financial pillar a little bit more, it consists of micro grants that cover the costs over and above the student's calculated cost of attendance, which is determined by financial aid. So these funds are fully supported through philanthropy, and there is no cap on how much students can apply to the necessity fund to cover emergencies, essential needs, which may include things such as medical bills, medication, immigration-related fees. Our professional development fund can be used to cover costs associated with graduate professional test preparation, professional attire, conference registration. In addition, we also have some first year perks that are only for our newly incoming students, and those include a round trip ticket home outside of the winter and summer breaks to combat homesickness, a winter coat grant, which is especially helpful for our large contingency from California. And also we offer break housing and grocery grants for times when the residence halls and dining halls are closed to combat the food insecurity and homelessness that may accompany that transition period. Next slide, please. One of our new signature programs that encompasses our pillars related to community building, empowerment advocacy, as well as advising is Mastering the Hidden Curriculum. And this photo is our inaugural cohort and some of our TAs, et cetera, in that photo. Mastering the Hidden Curriculum is a 1-credit, 10-week course that is designed specifically for first-year students who do identify as first-generation low income. It connects students with support resources across campus and encourages them to have conversations about power, academia's unspoken rules and expectations, such as what are office hours? How do I talk to my professor? How do I find a mentor? Current Georgetown faculty teach the course in 3 to 4 sections, so really utilizing a small group format where they get to know each other over the course of the class. And the TAs are upper class GS peers who also serve as peer mentors for the students enrolled. And the TAs are paid for their time, so that's also helping them to get some more work experience as well. Our preliminary assessment data demonstrates an increase in students' reported academic self-efficacy and sense of belonging based on a pre-test and post-test. And for those who are interested in learning more, the October 2018 edition of the Chronicle of Higher Education features an article by Dr. Marcia Chatelain, who taught one of the inaugural sections. She writes about her experiences and reflections teaching the course in that article. So these are some ways that we are working to increase accessibility to education and opportunity at Georgetown through GSP. In the next few slides, we'll talk more about what you can do in your respective units and organizations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, I want to refer back to the model that Dr. Bricado introduced earlier, and we'll be discussing multi-level action steps beginning with the individual. It always starts with you, it always starts within. And so increasing your self-awareness of your own biases, populations that you are less informed about and familiar with, and taking the initiative to educate yourself rather than relying on students to do that additional labor. Will be really important. Likewise, as Dr. Bricado mentioned, really tailoring your interventions, your programming. So while we have discussed general trends, recognizing that students are individuals, acknowledging that there is no one first-gen, low-income, fill in the blank for any type of demographic or identifier. There's no one narrative about that. And so building rapport with individual students over time, which is going to be a gradual process, to learn about their unique circumstances and needs. And that will also involve modeling the vulnerability that you're asking them to display by sharing and doing so first. Finally, through reflection and consultation with trusted colleagues, interrogating critically what you're teaching, designing, programming, who you are doing that for, who is the student that you have in mind and who that may leave out, as well as reflecting on whether you may be contributing to an overly stressful or competitive culture and how you can modify your approach to address that. Next slide, please. At the program level, you want to think about beginning to address systemic barriers. At GSP, we tell our students we want GSP to be a first stop and not a one stop, because our aim is not to build a university within a university, but to help make the whole university responsive and accessible for students of all backgrounds, so that all students feel like the university is their space, their place, versus just select offices on campus. This means that we proactively develop and maintain cross-campus and interdisciplinary collaborations in programming or coursework, helping students become aware of their resources all over campus as opposed to just within your unit or your office. And again, breaking down and defining that higher ed jargon versus assuming students know. So what is the provost? Again, what are office hours? What are they for? Even down to explaining what a syllabus is. Next slide, please. Finally, our broadest level of intervention or action strategies would be at the institutional level. As of July 1, GSP will be reporting to the newly formed Office of Student Equity and Inclusion at Georgetown, which will be housed within the Provost Office and led by Dr. Adna Johnson, the newly appointed Associate Vice President for Student Equity and Inclusion. This office has been several years in the making. It was developed beginning with a task force that included student input and student representation, and it represents a whole institution approach and commitment to equity and inclusion, as well as the structural integration of access, equity, student success, and diversity programming and services. So potentially, this could be something that you could use as, you know, other institutions are doing this. Perhaps that's something that's needed at your campus or organization. Recently, a campus partner did conduct preliminary analysis of a belonging survey specifically distributed to first-gen low-income students here at Georgetown, and it demonstrated that the majority of challenges or disruptions to belonging were taking place in the classroom and during faculty interactions. So for us, that was a signal that we want to further investigate and consider our ties with faculty and how we can strengthen our relationship to the academic side of things. I think this can also be an area of investigation for others to consider, again, how inclusive their pedagogy is, their curriculum, classroom management techniques, and when we are intentional and pause and slow down to think about these facets of learning, we can disrupt some of the automatic processes that we developed long ago and that we maybe are just in the habit of following that may no longer suit the students that we actually seek to serve and teach. Next slide, please. So again, one way that we have been integrating faculty into our program is through our existing first-gen faculty and staff initiative, which increases the visibility of folks on campus with that shared understanding of the background struggles and who are now on the other side of that. And we hand out pennants like the one maybe you can see behind me, you probably can't read it, that just helps to easily identify some of the first-gen faculty and staff. Research and some anecdotal data support that even small interventions like that can result in the student having higher expectations for themselves, being more hopeful about their ability to successfully matriculate, and also may make the faculty or staff person seem more approachable to them. Our whole program is built on what we would call intrusive or high touch advising, which is also characteristic of the Georgetown climate. And so it really takes into account cultural differences about asking for help, communicating with leadership or authority figures. And so even like the vision for my role as a fully embedded psychologist within the Georgetown Scholars Program goes against the traditional setup of waiting for students to come to the counseling center in order to receive those services, but making me more available, integrated within the community, and a familiar face that can build rapport and trust over time. And our hope with those types of models of thinking is that you do build that rapport and trust over time, and students will feel empowered to advocate for themselves and feel more confident about getting their needs met, as well as not necessarily waiting until they are at a crisis point to reach out for help. Finally, overall, utilizing a cultural community wealth approach, which is really just not taking a deficits approach, right? Looking at the strengths that these students, whatever their background, that help them to get to this point, helping to make them aware of those and view those as strengths, and looking at how we can enhance that and use that to help make them successful in this environment, rather than looking at what they lack, and really thinking about the resilience, resourcefulness, and creativity they bring. So that concludes my portion. And so I'm now going to turn it back over to my co-presenter, Dr. Bricado, for some closing remarks.
Yes, I am very much looking forward to getting into some of our audience questions. I always really appreciate the opportunities to learn from other folks who are engaging in this work with us. And there are already some great questions posted here in the Q&A. And before we move into that, I'd just like to offer up thanks again to Dr. Walker for presenting such a great program and taking the time to walk us through that. And throughout her discussion, we saw all the theory that we reviewed earlier. GSP is very clearly motivated by wanting its students to have an optimal experience at college and from a deep sense of caring about students' subjective well-being. The Four Pillars Foundation is an objectivist approach, while the individually tailored implementation keeps that approach equitable and effective across students with a range of identities, needs, and strengths. And Dr. Walker's presentation of how we can support students at the individual, programmatic, and institutional levels is very much an implementation of a multi-level socio-ecological approach. So thank you again for that wonderful program, and I am looking forward to getting into some of our questions.
Thank you both so much, and we had quite a few fabulous questions come in. Something that I noted from a few of the questions was first a deep appreciation for the work that's happening in the Georgetown Scholars Program and your work, Jo Ellen, but folks wondering how they might take this on if they are in a setting of a lower resource institution or without the kind of institutional support that Georgetown might provide.
That is an excellent question. I think that taking the mindset that something is better than nothing and starting somewhere, so you really have to begin somewhere to shift the culture of the institution. And so I think assessing all of your data and all of your efforts, even if it's just the number of students who come to the programs that you develop, to really later be able to have an argument and data to back up that this is something that's needed to get further resources. But like I mentioned, starting with just helping students to recognize that they're not alone. So finding opportunities for them to collectively meet. When GSP first started, Events would just consist of, here's a meal, let's talk, and pick a topic that folks may be dealing with. They come into the office, have some pizza, and get to know the one staff member who was over the program at that time. So I think a lot of good can come from even just a little bit in terms of the efforts.
Thanks, Joellen. Another question that we had come in is, do we have a sense of where students are reporting greater difficulty on campus, whether that's relegated to the academic space, the classroom, or if that's more occurring in the non-academic space, the social area, or if there's some sort of overlap between those two?
I can jump in. The belonging survey that I mentioned highlighted that a lot of students are experiencing stress or difficulty disruptions around belonging within the classroom. So they noted it was a mixed method study, and so students were able to elaborate on specific instances. And a number of folks detailed in the classroom disturbing or derogatory remarks being made by a classmate and the teacher not interrupting that or addressing it. And so in that way, kind of seeming okay with it or in agreement with it. And that was just one example of something. And then the other sphere where we see it here is within social settings. So people mention things like during orientation week, when folks are sharing about their summer experiences, having such a contrast as a first generation or low income student where, you know, they worked all summer and stayed home. Other folks talked about, you know, doing global travels. And so even initially already feeling set apart and different from so many of their peers, or during the course of the year, having difficulty explaining or not necessarily wanting to out themselves in a way when friends that they're making are wanting to go out frequently to brunch or at night for dinner, and they are not able to afford that on their budget.
I actually am seeing here in our Q&A a number of requests for resources. There have been requests, for instance, Joellen, could you share your belonging survey? And I'd like to, just in the interest of sort of open science and sharing resources, I'm putting through here on our chat a link to, on our website at the Wellbeing Collaborative, we are trying to start posting resources, freely available resources. The link that I just sent includes a catalog of existing measures for undergraduate student well-being that aren't just the well-being assessment, some listserv articles from us that maybe include some resources that might be helpful, and also some published citations connecting well-being, retention, and grades.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And I'll also add that whatever resources we might have that are relevant to the presentation, we will link those on the same page with the recording and the slides that will be available in the next few days for folks. And we're glad that there's so much interest in these resources. All right, another great question that we had come in is what suggestions our panelists might have for institutions that might not have diverse staff in place that are representing the student body accurately. And I know, Joellen, you kind of mentioned the first generation faculty recruitment process, but I wonder if there are other structures that you've seen in place in institutions that help this issue.
That is a good question. I think that my approach, especially having like a lot of experience in college center, like mental health centers, a lot of times that is a critique that students will make about feeling as though the staff is very homogeneous and may not understand their concerns. And so I would say, you know, being honest about the fact that, you know, at this time, these are the faculty and staff that we have, and really being open to having a dialogue with students about that. The other side of that would be like recruitment and retention, right? So when you are heading a search or when you're involved in a search committee, I know for myself, I always take a look at who is on the committee, who is in this room, and who is absent, and thinking about how I can bring the voices and the identities of those who are not present into the room and into the space, really thinking about standardization of that process and whether or not kind of personality or other characteristics are coming into consideration, and is that intentional or not. And then lastly, I would say, again, working with the staff and faculty that you have, really making cultural competence and understanding a priority and something that is ongoing continuing education that is required. I think oftentimes what I have found is that in a lot of higher ed institutions, sometimes particularly on the faculty side, there can be pushback for those in the most senior leadership to require additional things or what they consider to be additional tasks for tenure track faculty. But I challenge that and say that, you know, we all are a part of making the campus climate what it is. And if we want to improve that, then it is incumbent upon all of us to really engage in this collective learning. And that can look a lot of different ways, and also defining diversity, right, in a lot of different ways. Diversity of thought, thinking about folks who maybe are differently abled, in addition to some of the other characteristics that Dr. Bricado and I spoke about today, but really making that a priority. And I mean, there are lots of free resources online, but also thinking about that investment, like, is this worth us closing down our unit for a day, bringing someone in to facilitate, even engaging in conversations among ourselves? Because again, if we are not comfortable having that dialogue within ourselves, then how are we going to model that for the students?
Thanks, Joellen. Another great question that we had come in has to deal with sort of assessment and measurement. So beyond surveying the student body on their well-being and how it relates to their identities, is there an institutional assessment tool or checklist that folks might be able to use to assess the baseline of how their institution is doing?
There are actually a number of very good tools that each do slightly different things. So measures like the well-being assessment and the thriving quotient take a very nice broad approach to well-being, particularly psychological well-being. Of course, the National College Health Assessment from ACHA does a wonderful job of evaluating physical health and substance use, and also some core components of mental health. Healthy Minds does a wonderful job with mental health. We use that here at Wake and love it quite a bit. The NESE surveys and the Harry SERP surveys can tell you how your students are doing academically and how well they're engaged and what kinds of academic things they're engaged in. And then there are a growing number of campus climate evaluation tools that you can do. And unfortunately, I'm blanking on the names of specific ones, but the Williams Institute out of UCLA has a lot of good recommendations. The Tyler Clementi Center also has some good recommendations for evaluating campus climate. And across all these instruments, I think in addition to doing as well some self-directed and internal evaluations around what kinds of programs are you offering and what kinds of resources are you offering. And you can do that mapping work, not just across content, but like we keep talking about today, you can also do it across levels. So for instance, if you have a lot of well-being content, but it's all at the individual level, are there ways that you can provide well-being content or well-being supports that are more at the relational level or more at the community and environmental level? So I think a mixture, right, of using those instruments along with some internal program and resource mapping should give you a good evaluation of your context.
Nicole, you perfectly led into my next question, which is a theme I'm seeing among a couple of these Q&As that we're getting from folks, which is that, again, appreciating the GSP program, but noting that a lot of institutions don't have an officer program that might be specifically tailored for underserved student populations, and how we might think about ways that the general or core curriculum could help embed well-being at the cultural level.
Oh, would you like to get us started?
I can go first, and I'll be brief. Something that we have here that is more related to the academic side is called the Engelhard program, and that is where specifically a lot of folks in health education services and also within the counseling center. We are a CAP center, so counseling and psychiatric services. We partner with instructors, faculty, specific units to bring these concepts of well-being directly into the classroom. And so that can take many different forms. Sometimes it is like a workshop series that maybe will occur 1 to 3 times over the course of a semester. It could be on mindfulness. It could be working with the professor to really embed it in each class. So some folks may have decided to do a mindfulness activity at the start or the end of their class and had someone on our staff help them develop that. It may be engaging the students in a particular assignment. And so that's like literally bringing it into the classroom. Another instance that I would say apart from that is, again, really taking time to interrogate and think critically about your pedagogy, right? So is the curriculum representative of an array of experiences and backgrounds? And so when you look at your syllabus, are all of the folks who you're learning about and reading about and looking at on the screen, do they all look a certain way? Do they all have a certain story or path? And if not, how can you break that up and bring some different stories and narratives into the work that you're doing?
I have some thoughts here that are more about strategy rather than particular content. My project gets asked this a lot in the context of well-being programming, just sort of more generally. We get lots of comments like, we're a small school, unlike Wake, we don't have an office that's just dedicated to well-being. How can we do all of this work that we're hearing is recommended? And the strategy that actually we've taken at Wake, and we've seen a number of other schools take on successfully, is actually to decentralize the work a little bit. So rather than saying there's only one person in one office who can develop and disseminate and implement this programming, you have a committee or a person develop a framework, and then other folks are at liberty to take on that framework and implement work based on that framework. So here at Wake, for instance, we use our well-being program is called Thrive, and we use leaves as our model. Different colored leaves are assigned to different well-being dimensions. And then whoever wants to can take a leaf and go do programming around that leaf. And so I think that's right, one way that is to think about doing any of this kind of complicated multi-level, multi-office programming work as being a collaborative effort and a decentralized effort rather than one person in one office. Another way to think about this here, and we've started sort of touching on that, is what can we do to support our faculty and staff well-being? So students learn from us, and when you're in front of a group of students or you're working with your staff peers every day, whatever well-being skills you have, everybody knows what those well-being skills are and where maybe you could do with some well-being skill growth. So the things that we ourselves bring to our workplace and to our classrooms have an enormous and huge impact on our students' well-being, right? There's like a trickle-down effect. And I know that there are some great programs. For instance, Deborah Donahue-Keehan at Tufts, who's with us today, is doing some really exciting faculty-focused programming around how we can support student well-being.
Thanks so much, Nicole, and love the shout out to Deborah. Hi, Deborah. So Nicole, I know in the very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there were a myriad of ways to define and understand well-being. And one of our attendees asked the question, can the speakers comment not only on the topic of belonging, which is so important, but also on the overarching national trend of anxiety and mental health problems ever increasing in the student body?
So in that structural equation modeling slide that I presented toward the end of my slide, we include in our subjective well-being indicator, it's actually a second order factor model that includes factors for happiness, life satisfaction, self-esteem on the positive side, and then depression, anxiety, loneliness, and social anxiety on the negative side. So it's a score that includes positive things and negative things. So these results that I'm showing about how subjective well-being is related to students' number of marginalized identities includes at least some components, I think, of what's being asked there, which is some of these mental health outcomes. And certainly there are a number of resources. I think most of this work has been done in small group settings. I think there's some research, scalability research to be done, but we see research from folks like Sonia Lubomirsky and Martin Seligman demonstrating that well-being focused programming or interventions, because it's usually done small scale in these studies, can help ameliorate some mental health challenges, right? It's not the same as doing CBT or a particular kind of therapeutic intervention. It has a little bit more of a preventive flavor to it, but we're very much in need of at the moment, I think, is some research to how do we take some of these small scale programs and individual kind of level efforts that we're seeing in some of our more recent published research and scale them up, because the things that you do with the half a dozen students in a discussion group and a workshop in your class, right, are very different from the things that you can do when you're trying to reach the entire campus setting. And I don't know that we have answers to that yet. So Greg Walton's team is doing a lot of interesting work around scalable programming and intervention for belonging, but I don't know if we're seeing that yet as much for some of these other areas of well-being.
Thanks, Nicole. I think we probably just have time for one more question. It's a great one, and I'm hoping that we can get to it in just the few minutes that we have left here. Can the speakers comment on the role of colleges, especially colleges embedded in urban settings, vis-a-vis contributing to changing the conditions that continue to promote and sustain marginalization, and whether there's any data on how the college community interaction impacts the student well-being?
This is an excellent question that we certainly don't have time to fully unpack. But what I will say is that there definitely is research to support that it is impacting students, particularly if students are noticing that community members they feel are more closely aligned to their own backgrounds and experiences, whereas folks that they're seeing within the confines of the campus or who are considered a part of the campus community have more contrasting experiences. And so that kind of sometimes referred to as like town and gown relationships, or how integrated the community is with the campus, certainly can provide opportunities to enhance well-being. I think it's a tight line around how that is framed, right? Because sometimes service learning, et cetera, can really feel like we're going out in the community, even though the university is in the community, to kind of help other folks, as opposed to seeing how, there's this mutually influential relationship, and how can we bring the strengths of the community to enrich the campus and vice versa. So I'll stop there so that my colleague has an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, we are just starting to think about at the well-being assessment how we can use our data to look at larger contextual factors in particular kinds of activities, and this multi-level, what are the effects of the larger community in which we live. I am just going to share here again in our chat window a link to our website, to our publications page. Some of my team just last week presented some new material at NASPA Regions 2 and 3 about school characteristics and their associations with student well-being, and we found some interesting effects for public versus private and size of school and region that the school is located in. But I would say, right, this is very early days, so I don't think this is really a great answer to the question that you're asking. I think these are more just some initial thoughts to contribute to this really important discussion.
All right, with that, I just want to say a huge thank you to our fabulous presenters, Joellen and Nicole. A big thank you to our friends at AAC&U, and thank you all for joining us. We hope that you got something out of this webinar. Just a reminder that a recording of this webinar, the slides, and all of the new resources that we've spoken about will be available in the upcoming days at the link that we've posted quite a few times in the chat box. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.